welcome you to this evening's program. And I have to say another good word for Patrick Steele. Isn't he a wonderful young man? He's a sophomore at Clemson. His major is language and international trade, and he's just a treasure. And we love having him on the program. As is typical with our programs, we have a panel this evening, and the panel is made up of a mix of students and faculty, and I'd like to introduce them. And then following the program, they'll come up to the mic and reintroduce themselves to the speaker. Starting off will be Abby Russell, and Abby is a sophomore with a dual major in history and Spanish. Abby, please, there you go. The second student will be Donovan Jones, and Mr. Jones is a sophomore in financial management. Donovan, thank you. From the history department, we'll then have Rod Andrews, and Rod. And finally, Will Hyatt, and Will is the director of historic properties, and he's an instructor in the history department at Clemson. So every time you go through Fort Hill, it's Will's handiwork you're seeing as you wander through. So thank you, Will. I'm particularly pleased tonight that this evening's program is sponsored by two folks I consider good friends and colleagues and a mentor in Bruce. Dr. Bruce Yandel and Dot Yandel sponsored this evening's program, and so please give them a nice round of applause. Now, following the program today, Jim Megginson will be autographing his book in the lobby. It's a fine book. I had the opportunity to go through it for a public radio interview I'll be conducting with him for the statewide broadcast. And I found it to be a very touching book. As I started through, it was I started it as a history, but it engaged you. It engaged you in the life of a place that I call home. And it gave me new perspective on what has happened in our communities in the past and hopefully where we're going in the future. Wonderful piece. I'd commend it to you for observation and for your consideration. To introduce Dr. Megginson, it's my pleasure to introduce Dot Yandel. Now, how do you describe someone that so embodies an area that just as Dot does, this part of our community? If there were an official historian for Old Calhoun, it would be Dot. It's the community just across the tracks from Clemson where old Clemson began in the Calhoun area. I remember when Bruce said, "We're moving to the house over there by the railroad tracks," and I said, "You know, there are trains that go by that thing, and they go fast by that thing." But it's with love and care that they've taken care of that place. She's not just a historian. Dot's also a journalist. Many know her as a person that was the editor of a daily here, first as a weekly, the Messenger, and that then grew into the paper that many of us get and some of us occasionally like. She then became the editor of Clemson's Agricultural Experiment Station and eventually the head of Clemson News Service. With a special love for this place, it's only natural that Dot would be introducing tonight's speaker. Please welcome Dot Yandel. Now, I also have a special recognition for Dot and Bruce. For tonight's program sponsorship, we have a commemorative program for them, and I'll carry it down to Bruce so you don't have to. Okay, thanks, Dot.
Good evening. It's a well-known fact that most New Yorkers have never been to the top of the Empire State Building. Likewise, most of us have never been tourists in our own hometowns. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Jim Megginson, is going to change all of that. He's going to be our tour guide through the history of our special part of upstate South Carolina. I think when the evening is over, he will have inspired us all to be dedicated local tourists and to do some exploring on our own. Jim was born in the Clemson area, but left when he was 2, never to return permanently except for a few years in the mid-90s. But throughout his life, he's come back regularly to visit family and friends and to do research. Jim graduated from Mississippi College and went on to get master's and PhD degree from George Washington University. He taught some 25 years in Arkansas and Philadelphia and held for several years an adjunct position in Clemson University's history department. Although he's lived mostly away from the state, he's been an active scholar in the area of South Carolina history, with particular emphasis on the Piedmont. This past year, the USC Press published his latest book, African American Life in South Carolina's Piedmont, 1784 to 1900. I have to say, it's a magnificent piece of research, has wonderful pictures, and it's highly readable. So, what has kept Jim Megginson so interested in our part of the state might have a lot to do with his roots. His great-grandparents owned land adjacent to the Fort Hill plantation, and his grandparents, Jim says mainly his grandmother, ran the Smith Hotel and Boarding House on Calhoun Street, where it still sits with dignity and grace today. It's the Alpha Gamma Rho fraternity house now. And as an aside, Jim says that his grandmother was such a manager that if she were alive today, she would probably be running General Motors. Long summer visits to his grandparents were magical times, and they might have been the reason for his later love of the history of our town and the Tri-County area. Many of us first met Jim when he delivered a lecture to the community during the celebration of the university's centennial in 1989. His topic then was the old town of Calhoun, and many of you know it only became Clemson in the 1940s. After that lecture, plenty of us found ourselves traipsing through churchyards, reading tombstones, and seeking out historic sites that we had just totally ignored before. That might happen again tonight to you after you hear Jim talk. So now, I give you the pilot of our time machine who will escort us through time and place as only a good professor of history can do, from frontier to cell towers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jim Megginson.
Thank you, Dot, and I appreciate being here. Let me tell you about the first time I met Dot. We were talking together 20 years ago when I was working on the program Town of Calhoun, which we did during the centennial. We wound up at Fort Hill Presbyterian Church, and we had a fairly large crowd turn out, actually 300. Dot was working, I believe, with the Chamber of Commerce, and was responsible for the reception afterwards. So while I was talking, she was out running around madly trying to get additional refreshments to be available over at Calhoun Corners where we had the session. I have what may be a piece of good news for you tonight. I am not running for president, even though there's a panel here ready to ask questions and grill me, and I'm not running. I may be using lots of personal anecdotes in the talk, and it may sound like I'm running, but I refuse if anybody tries to draft me. I am privileged to be here. I know among your speakers in the past, there have been many distinguished men and women, and I'm happy to join in that sequence. Along with what Dot said, I may, however, be one of the very few to talk about this immediate area, and more specifically, probably the only one to talk about 200 years of it in what I hope will be the amount of time you're expecting to get out of here. I'll finish. There are two surprising things about what we know about this whole area. One is how much has been done on this area. I just continue to marvel when I see various exhibits, when I go to the various museums, pick up brochures at the Welcome Center and at Pendleton District Commission and other places, how much has and is continuing to be done. The other equally surprising thing is how much has yet to be done, and I'm going to try to move us a little bit in that direction this evening. It's also incredible how many books there are for this area. I tried compiling a bibliography last year. I think there's some available I'll mention at a later time where you can pick one up. And it was just incredible. There's some in just about every town of this area. Some of them are from the Arcadia seaweeds that you'll be familiar with, like Oconee County, but just about every town in this whole immediate area has one, and subject areas as well. Among other fairly more recent books, quite a few of you will be familiar with Trent Allen's book, primarily photographic, which deals with the entire area. And then, of course, the most recent book to be published on this area is by Ann Russell, Legacy of a Southern Lady, which is not only the first biography by any female in the Calhoun or Clemson families, but is one of an infinitesimal number of biographies on any woman in the upstate. And it may be even broader than that. I've spent time checking with people, and they're having serious difficulty figuring out where there is another biography and how many dozens or hundreds of miles we have to go from here farther in the state before there is one. A lot of the local historians have produced cemetery books recording every cemetery tombstone in the whole area. You know, there are lots of the John C. Calhoun books about him and his letters. There are compilations of snippets from the newspapers from the 1870s on, and even earlier in the early 1800s from the Pendleton Messenger. Genealogical Society, the Old Pendleton Genealogical Society, has created an enormous database of genealogical information, and that's available. On the other hand, one of the things that's badly missing in this area is, strangely, WPA histories. When I was doing a lot of my research, I kept talking to people elsewhere in the state, and they talked about this county history done by the WPA and this other set of documents done by the WPA. And I kept checking, and those types of things mostly were not done in this area, with one exception. Someone did a very thorough job of documenting almost all of the churches in Anderson County, and a good deal of data on what those churches were like in the 1830s. There are likewise missing huge chunks of documents, especially the antebellum tax records, but there are lots of other things available too, and more hands are needed to deal with those. Part of what I'd like to do this evening is begin working on a synthesis. There are lots of these pieces, all sorts of places, but we've done very, very little to begin bringing these together. And I'd like to give some insight in what types of things may be done about that. When I was working my own book, I had to hunt lots and lots and lots of different places because there was no one single source to give me any specific fact or story or anything else. And so I'm keenly aware of the need for more synthesis and more bringing it together. Let me give you a very tentative outline I have constructed myself, and it's open to lots of testing, challenging, whatever else, of what I see as 5 or 6 major periods in local history. What this does, I think, is to help emphasize the major trends that have occurred in each of these periods and give us sort of some highlights over 200 years. These are, of course, a subject, like I say, to challenge, and I hope more people will be working on that. The first period I call, quite appropriately, the frontier, because that's exactly what we had in this region. This immediate area, the soil beneath our feet, wasn't available for purchase with a legal deed before 1784, shortly after the Revolution was finished. And during the next 10, 20, maybe 30 years, it was quite literally a frontier. There were huge numbers of people passing through. It was almost like a wagon route. In fact, it was, with people coming down the wagon road from Virginia and through the North Carolina, through other parts of South Carolina. Some stopped and stayed here for a while. Many just passed through. Those that stayed a while sometimes moved later on. If you look at the 1790 and the 1800 census and compare them, there's a vast difference between the names you find in the two, and additional differences when you get on through 1810 and maybe a bit later as well. There were huge numbers of boundary disputes, feuds, often very rowdy behavior. Ironically, or not perhaps so ironic, the first two laws that were enacted by the district government, as it was then, were laws, one, to regulate cattle brands, because otherwise cattle were going to be stolen, and that was the only way to make sure that people could preserve their own rights in their own cattle, and probably appropriate, especially for a frontier, liquor measurement, so you could get an honest measure of whatever your liquor was going to be. One of the interesting insights into the attitude of people at that time came from the late 1700s. One of the first people to locate up here was John Ewing Calhoun, father-in-law of John C. Calhoun. The man who helped him with his work up here while he was often down in the low country wrote and said, "Tell your wife not to be afraid to visit the back country once more. Tell her I've got 5 guns, all surefire, and when danger is approaching, myself and you will each one of us shoulder a few of them and march up the hill as a reinforcement." So a lot of sense of danger. Some of it may have been legitimate. The Native Americans weren't too terribly happy having their land taken away, and there were some conflicts with that. There were conflicts between Tories and people who weren't very happy about the Tories being in the area. At least 1 or 2, I understand, were lynched. And Native Americans stayed in the area at least for another 2 or 3 decades, and some much, much longer than that. And a lot of people still have Indian ancestors who are living in this, and those people having Indian ancestors are living around us today. The very northwestern corner of the state, way up in the northern part of the counties, didn't even become part of South Carolina until 1816, so there were lots of fluid things going on. Perhaps earlier, but certainly by 1820, this became pretty much a settled area with a life that was a little bit more tame, with people who were staying here for decades. If you take now the 1820 census and the 1860 census, particularly slave owners, but for a lot of other people, you will find an amazing continuity. So the people just moving everywhere in the earlier part had stopped, and we began to have a fairly settled period at that time. Even though a lot of people stayed here, often a younger brother or son might move on westward, often to Alabama. So while there was a core population remaining here, there were strong connections between both this area and places somewhat to the west, perhaps Georgia, perhaps Mississippi, but Alabama was one of the favorite places at that particular time. This area at that time had an array of different people, whites, of course, slaves, and free people of color. Often these intermingled. At that time, there were not separated churches. There was a church, a Baptist church, and people of all the different various statuses I just mentioned would attend that service and often sit on the same benches. The types of stereotypes we have of the antebellum life don't often quite fit the upstate. Many of them are much, much more appropriate to the lower part of the state, and relationships here certainly were not equal, but they were more closely interrelated in terms of people and their connections with each other. In this particular area, what we had were mostly small plantations and mostly small slave holdings. Most slave owners in the area had under 20 slaves. That still may sound like a fair number to some of you, but let's parcel that out. Of those 20, half would probably be under 15, and maybe a third would be under 10. So we're talking about a relatively small number of adult workers, and often even in a family holding of that size, the owner might well be working in the field along with the slave, and there are substantial numbers of documented cases where that occurred, so we know that that was a reality of the day. There were, where people owned slaves, daily contacts, almost always with their slaves, and especially on small farms. Owners knew their slaves. Often low country owners who had 100, 200, 300, 400 slaves didn't recognize their own slaves except the relatively small number who would work for them immediately in the household and take care of needs with their carriage and maybe the blacksmith and a few others. So there wasn't that type of interaction that in the low country that we experienced up here. In fact, there's one fascinating story of a low country owner who was riding along, saw some interesting growth along the side of the road and asked somebody what that was, and they said, "That's your major crop." He was so separated from that he didn't even recognize what his major source of income was. Those of you who have read anything about John C. Calhoun know that all the stories say in the family correspondence that he was very attached to the fields, that he would ride over them daily. He would try to see what was going on, make sure where there was damage that needed to be corrected. And looking through the John C. Calhoun papers, I did a count, and there are at least 50 or 60 slaves that John C. Calhoun and the rest of his extended family mentioned in their letters to each other, expecting that people 50 to 100 miles away among their extended family would know who those slaves were by name, and that gives us a much better insight, even for a family that held 50 or upwards to 100 slaves at some times. Again, what we do not know, we know very little, virtually nothing, about people who were landless and people who were white tenants. Up to 50% of the white population fell into that category. Some of these were relatives of owners. Some of them were sons waiting to inherit. Many of them, however, were simply people who did not have land, never expected to have land. Some of them occasionally were overseers. We know virtually nothing about overseers in this whole area. Rather strange when you consider that there were so many of them. And we have virtually no information about the lives of these other whites who did not own land themselves. The Pendleton vicinity, the immediate Pendleton area, is very much the most documented, but also because, of course, it was fairly affluent. And a number of you will have seen the various books done about the low country people who did come up this area, build the various plantations, such as Ashtabula, the Maverick Plantation, and a variety of others, Woodburn, and helped to make the area a little bit more civilized, a little bit more affluent, and contributed to that. Pendleton, in fact, was the only town in this Tri-County area until 1828. The whole area then operated to Pendleton District. After that, there was only one additional town for the next 20-some-odd years. Anderson District was formed in 1828, and this sort of is the same time that my ties to the immediate area occur, because a great-great-grandfather moved just north from Abbeville County to Anderson Town, village actually, and had lots right next almost to the courthouse. The major change in this area prior to the Civil War was in the 1850s, when the Blue Ridge Railroad began to move up this way and towns of Williamston, Honeypath, and Belton were created, and then as the train moved on to Walhalla as well. Spoke to a class yesterday and gave them a test to see if they knew what was the importance of Tunnel Hill, just north of Walhalla. And for those of you who are not locals, in part because the train was supposed to keep on going, but it didn't get that any farther than that. And secondly, and most important, at least to my personal taste, is that's where Clemson blue cheese now comes from. On the other hand, while Pendleton was, at least in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, a fairly upscale society, Mrs. John C. Calhoun, by at least the 1850s and not earlier, was fairly contemptuous of the town. She did not like to shop there. She would order liquor, clothing, and even a carriage from Charleston, all of that from Charleston, despite the fact that there were quite a few carriage makers in Anderson County and some in Pendleton itself. Let's move then to 1865 to 1895 and perhaps just a little bit later. During that period, there were substantial readjustments. Of course, the Civil War was just over. That did not impact this immediate area as much as it did much of the rest of the South. Certainly, of course, there were people whose sons, fathers, husbands were killed in the war, very lamentably. On the other hand, there was virtually no physical destruction. Houses were not burned, things were not torched, very little was stolen, and so in general, society continued on pretty much the same level as it had been before. Slaves were freed, but where could they go? The only place that most of the free people could go was to work for some landowner, and in most cases that was a former slave owner, either their own or somebody else's. There were lots of continuing contacts between former slaves and owners. We find not just from all sources that there were many, many families that were still in touch with or hiring constantly or just housing freed people up into the 1880s, 1890s, and in some cases providing them plots in their own cemeteries and other things. There were lots of other people who were not so kind, but there were these types of continuing interactions that went on over a very long period of time. In contrast also to lots of other areas, particularly the Low Country, very few slaves, once they were freed, moved away from this area. So there was a very substantial continuity among the black community rather than a major disruption. And there are any number of African American people in this entire area who can trace their ancestors back to the pre-Civil War area and know a good deal about their family and their extended relations and who all of these were, where they settled. Reconstruction also had a little bit less impact in the Upper Piedmont here than anywhere else in the state, partly because there was no black majority vote. Anderson, Oconee, and Pickens were three of the very few, 5 or 6 or 7, depending on the year, that sent all white delegations to the state legislature, and with very few exceptions, all of the local offices still were retained by whites. So there was not the type of change that often occurred in other places, and those of you who are Civil War and Reconstruction experts know many other places where major riots occurred and some massacres and other types of things. There were hardly any black office holders, but they were active in elections, and particularly in Anderson County, the rate of black participation in the elections was pretty high. And the black males, particularly adult males in Anderson, were very diligent in petitioning the governors. Up to 90% of black males in Anderson did that, so at least they got very much involved in the spirit of the Reconstruction period and beginning to develop their own rights, their own lives. Also, black organizations quickly developed. There were black churches as early, apparently, as 1865, and certainly a fair number, approximately 12, in 1868 that formed the Rocky River Baptist Association. In the 1930s, the one thing that did happen by WPA in this area was the census of churches, which occurred primarily in Anderson County and just a very few in either Pickens or Oconee. But the man who did the work in Anderson County did a very good job of documenting the churches, went beyond the questions that were on the standard WPA form and asked additional questions, and sizable numbers of black people volunteered information that whites had either helped them in organizing the church, just providing leadership, some cases by donating the land, either by donating a building or a variety of other things, and some of the black churches were named for the white donors. So there was a degree, again, of continuing interrelationship, not necessarily ever equal, but at least a situation where people knew each other and could deal with each other. Whites, however, still dominated, especially in sharecropping, because barely 10% of the African American population prior to 1900 and for a while afterwards owned land and could cultivate on their own. 90-some-odd% of African Americans were working for whites, and that continued for quite a few decades into the 20th century. Major changes did occur in the post-Civil War period. One of the immediate ones was the fact that Oconee County was split off from Pickens District, which it had been under its jurisdiction previously, and Oconee County became a separate entity. I asked the class yesterday if they had any idea, if they had been sitting in that classroom in 1850, what county they would have been in. They assume Pickens as it is now, but for a long while, until the 1950s, the strip of land, including Clemson College, was in Oconee County, not to be changed until many decades later. Railroads were the major development of the post-Civil War period. Very shortly after the war was over, Atlanta, which supposedly was burned and was destroyed, became a big city with lots of activity going on, lots of fairly prosperous firms, and among those was the railroad that started from Atlanta and was going at various times either to Charlotte, to Richmond, or later on became the Southern Railroad. What the railroad did was to provide transportation through this area for the first time by anything other than a little bit of river traffic, horse and buggy or horse and carriage, or simply walking or whatever else. But now things could be shipped very quickly and fairly cheaply over a long distance. The major product then that this applied to quickly became cotton. Cotton was important and a significant crop before the Civil War, but it greatly escalated in the economy of the local area after 1870 and after the arrival of the railroad. So did new towns along the railroad. Those nearby would be Westminster, Seneca, Central, Liberty, and Easley, all of which thrived primarily because of the railroads. Railroads could bring lots of other products and make life better for people around here in that case. In additional situations, there was an electric train between Anderson and Greenville, and for a while there was a similar operation between Anderson and Pickens itself, the town of Pickens, which in fact was a new town once the previous location, what is now called Old Pickens, became part of Oconee County. A brand new place had to be located, the current town of Pickens. Let me give you a couple of illustrations about the railroad and its importance around here. For those of you who remember the Calhoun Corners building before it was burned, if you ever paid much attention to it, as you looked on the side nearest the railroad in the front part of the store as you would enter, you would have seen two very large doors, each of them about that wide. And that was where they brought the freight in directly across the street from the depot. And if you look at any of the records or even just the pictures of that time, the freight part of the railroad expedition was far more important in total revenue and in everything else than was the passenger. So all they had to do was unload the groceries straight across the street and the other things that any general store would occupy. In this immediate area, there were mill towns, all sorts of places. We don't have to go very far from where we're sitting right now to think of these. There were, of course, some at Newry, some at Central. There were the Issaquah mills. There were much more elaborate mills over at Piedmont and at Pelzer, and lots of others throughout the entire area. So cotton became literally king cotton in this entire area. As we know far too well, cotton is useful only once it's picked, and that was another major part of the whole sharecropping experience for both whites and African Americans. I talked several years ago with a white family who had lived for a while in Woodburn. They were tenants, I guess, but they were mostly sharecroppers as well. And they picked cotton just like black people did. And so this was not quite as segregated again as lots of our stereotypes. Moving on, and the exact timing and shifting of these various periods obviously is partly arbitrary and not exact. A period from about 1893 to roughly 1955 shows quite different changes happening at that time. Among other things, and one reason for choosing 1893 is that's the year Clemson Agricultural College accepted its first students. There was an enormous amount of prison labor that helped develop the campus, starting from the very beginning. If you look in the 1900 census, there were some 300 plus convicts who were working on the campus at that time. Some of you have seen some of the photographic books, have seen some pictures of some of that, and can appreciate the significance of that. Education was far more limited than we may think when we go back to that period. The first class of 500, first group probably is a more accurate word, who came to Clemson in 1893 consisted of two parts. 250, half of the original students who came here, came not for college but for high school because they didn't have a high school available in their hometown. And Clemson didn't have a high school until that happened as well. Education was fairly limited during that whole period of time throughout the entire state. I've looked through the state superintendent of education records. They're always lamenting there's not enough education, not enough money, and trying to develop more schools, getting more money, with the major problem that throughout the state, large numbers of white and black had to go out and pick cotton. And so they might go to school for a month or two, then have to go back to the fields, and then maybe after that they could go back to school again. So even when they had schools, they were broken up into very short terms. The schools in Pickens County in 1900 averaged 2.5 months per year, so not very much education was going on. We can track this within my own family. My oldest uncle or aunt, Uncle Wayman, born in 1892, went to a small one-room school where there were only 8 grades, with, of course, all those 8 grades within one room. Not only was it only a one-room building, that building also doubled as the local church, so it was one that had to serve both functions. After he finished 8 grades in the very early 1900s, he then came to Clemson for his high school years. Slightly later, by 5 years, I believe, his sister Ethel Elmore, for those of you who may recognize the name, finished her 8 years and then went to Central Wesleyan for a year or two to pick up some post-8th grade studies. And for any of you, again, who know the name Faith Clayton, the two of them were involved going to school together over there. Within our family, then, we can chronicle when the first person in the family was available to go to the 9th grade once that was added, and then the 10th grade. My mother was, I believe, the first in the family to graduate from the 10th grade, and that was where the school stopped. This was the Calhoun Clemson School, founded, I believe, in 1916. She and a number of others were going to Winthrop College. The Winthrop College decided not to accept them because during the summer there was an 11th grade added, and require these young women to come back to high school for another year, so they were among the very few in the country who have graduated from high school twice. The 10th grade class had about 26 students, mixed males and females, only females wanting to go to either Winthrop or a place like that came for the 11th grade, so it was a very sparse class and a very tight-knit one. When the fellows came here in 1893 to school, huge numbers had never seen indoor lights before. This was a brand new experience for them. Huge numbers had never seen indoor toilets before. And it's a good thing they were on the campus because there weren't any indoor toilets anywhere else within miles of this immediate area from where we're sitting right now. Shortly, however, utilities did come to Clemson because it, with state money and other sources, could afford to have utilities, indoor plumbing, lights, electricity, and telephones. These were considerably slower coming to the surrounding area. I could do a quick quiz and ask you if you have any idea what city you are in right now. And if you said the city of Clemson, you would have been wrong, because Clemson College operated as an independent municipality. So once you set foot beyond the traffic light at the main intersection downtown, you were either not in a town, or if you went farther, depending on the period of time, you were in the town of Calhoun. The area that was the town of Calhoun, beginning from where we are again, roughly at the Presbyterian Church, going a half mile to the railroad tracks and then a half mile on the other side. It was just a neat, complete circle with the center being the railroad, again, an example of how significant the railroad was at that time, did not get utilities to the 1930s when through the WPA, CCC workers came in and provided all those utilities to the surrounding town. In contrast to many earlier periods of this area's history, the time from roughly 1900 to slightly before on to the 1950s was relatively calm. Churches were in each of the surrounding towns. The churches were incredibly harmonious, maybe not within a specific church, but there seems to have been no denominational arguments back and forth between churches, and at least in the 1950s, and I remember maybe the 1960s, when this was a much smaller area, students would have been gone for the summer, and several of the churches in the town of Clemson would hold union services and rotate among the different churches all summer. The longest lasting establishment in this area, as I'm sure you probably know, is Keller's. And they are the firm that has been here actually since the 1890s, and are not only that, but they are a multi-generational family, because the Kellers running it today are now the third and fourth generation of those who've been there all along. Paved roads first came to Clemson in the 1920s, fortunately because one of the faculty wives had influence with the governor, and so they got it much earlier than they would have earlier. I think I just heard myself say roads. I should say paved road, the forerunner of what is 93 today. Especially from the 1880s and 1890s and continuing a little bit after that, there was a surprising amount of moving around. Some of you may know the book by Jane Morris on Pickens. The two of us were doing research at the same time during the day up at the county courthouse, and then in the evening we'd both run into each other again at the Pickens County Library looking at microfilm. We would share information back and forth, and I would talk about people who were in Clemson, and she said, oh, well, they were over in Pickens too, or they had been in Central, then they would go to Pickens. So although the general area was fairly stable, there was a good deal of this shifting around back and forth. Once again, the whole area had a good deal of interrelationships among black and white. Let me give you just a few particular situations about this that I have found and documented personally. One white family in Pendleton, perhaps in the 1850s, so appreciated their cook, who if the time is accurate, Patsy would have been a slave who was a cook. They had a charcoal drawing made of Patsy. That drawing was passed down through several generations of the white family, and then sometime, I'm guessing about the 1960s, it was passed to the black family and is still available to be seen in the Black Heritage and the Upper Piedmont exhibit. Several years ago, I was tangentially involved with the Tennis Maxwell Cemetery project, which was directed by Pat Pritchard, who got his doctorate here at Clemson. He was working with a camp, a school for boys, primarily, all boys, from difficult families where there'd been all sorts of trouble. So he set up a process of using abandoned black cemeteries as a teaching project. And in the process of doing all that, they established very good relationships with the local black churches and lots of other people. I went to the dedication of that cemetery a number of years ago, and among the people who were there was a black couple and a white couple. They discovered that between them they had lots of mutual friends, and they just spent quite a amount of time chatting back and forth and sharing stories. Bill Greenlee, of course, as you recognize if you've been in this area for several decades, was a very favorite person throughout the entire area and has a room up at the Clemson House named for him and his photograph as well. Among the few people I interviewed in the black community, one of them was Tom Dupree, a man I had never met. I knew the family name, knew the name of his mother and of his aunt, who happened to have been my grandmother's laundress at her boarding house. He knew me, however, fairly well, at least my family. When we chatted, I found out he had worked at my grandfather's general store, something that perished before I was born, and I knew virtually nothing about it, so he had a piece of information there. And it turned out he had my aunt's dining room suit, because when my aunt died, The daughters did not need it, and not only did they pay him, of course, for his help in cleaning out the house, but they gave him the dining room suite as well. I also interviewed Lucinda Reed Brown, who was 98 when I talked to her and totally clear as a bell and would fuss if I asked her a question a second time and say, I've already told you that, let's not go through that again. What she didn't recognize is that the first time we talked, I did not have a tape recorder, and the second time I was trying to get a lot of that on tape. She periodically would turn to me and say, your grandfather, no, your great-grandfather, because she had known every generation of my family. She told a couple of stories about my great-grandmother, and I have passed these quite a few years later on to my aunt, who was born more than 10 years after her grandmother died. Never heard a single thing about her grandmother from her own mother, so by a circuitous route from Lucinda Reed Brown to me, back to my aunt to learn about her grandmother. One of the anecdotes in the final chapter of my book is about a brief session with Viola Williams. Back roughly 20 years ago, in the early years when Will Hyatt was at the Calhoun Mansion, and along with the director at that time, we got Viola Williams over to the Calhoun Mansion to talk about it because her mother had been a cook there in the early part of the 1900s. And in fact, her grandmother had been a slave in the extended Calhoun family, though not the John C. Calhoun family. She went through and pointed out all sorts of different things about the mansion to us and gave us a good idea of what it was like. After we left and were standing outside, I was trying to get a little bit better feel for black and white interrelations in the town. So given her age, I asked if she happened to know Mamie Crawford, a cousin, and more precisely what, I guess a cousin of my mother's or even my grandmother's generation, used to work at the drugstore downtown. And Mrs. Williams told me the story that she walked in the post office, the one that used to be on campus near the visitor center but is no longer there, and found a wallet with, I think, $100 in it. And somehow there was a name. She recognized Mamie's name, rushed outside, found her, and according to Mrs. Williams, she said, Mamie just hugged and hugged her and hugged her and could hardly let her go for having rescued her wallet and her money. The next period I would divide roughly as 1955 to the present. And that has, in contrast to any of the earlier periods, been marked by much, much more substantial societal and technological change. One hallmark, or two hallmarks, for some of the change in a very local sense was in either 1954 or 1955, the Calhoun Post Office, just north of the railroad tracks, depending on the period of time, just one door or two up from where the Yandles live, closed permanently. Just about the same time, the Bog store just across the street, what became Calhoun Corners, closed. And those were sort of a passing of an era, and I know lots of people, including myself as a kid, understood that as well. In the 60s, all sorts of newfangled things came along. Hartwell Dam, the new 123 bridge, and I-85, and all of these, as you are keenly aware, dramatically changed the whole area, partly bringing recreational opportunities that had never been there before, bringing relatively high-speed travel into and out of the area, and more a separation of people than had occurred before. In the 1950s, one of the most drastic things that had happened to the college up until that time occurred. It admitted women. At the same time, they, of course, stopped the military operation that the school had functioned in over a very long time. Pendleton District Commission people did some interviews roughly 30 years ago, and one of the white women being interviewed at the time said she thought that the change to admit women was far more drastic in changing the nature of the whole area than was admitting African Americans, which would occur roughly a decade later. And then, of course, much more generally throughout the entire area was integration of high schools. At that particular time, some factors probably related to that, though we don't know the whole story. The old Calhoun Clemson High School was burned and led ultimately to the merger of several schools in the building of Daniel High School. The same time, the Methodist Church was burned, and Harvey Gantt was admitted to Clemson College, Clemson University by that time, much, much more calmly than it occurred, for example, in Mississippi. The area was expanding enormously in population, stores. Now that you had cars, you could get to the stores in Greenville to Anderson and lots of other places far more quickly than you ever had before, which led, of course, to the type of thing I just mentioned with the Bog store closing down in the 1950s. And one of the remarkable things this also shows is the tenacity of the Keller store, which is still there. I've got a quick illustration over on this side, I believe. From Keller store, you probably cannot see this where you're located, but you may want to step up later. This is me as a little kid with a t-shirt that says Clemson, ? The assumption was that all kids would be going to Clemson. Weren't quite sure which year, but it would be certainly to Clemson. And these were produced and sold at Keller store. So that again gives a hallmark of the enormous influence this institution has had throughout its entire history. Something else I ran across just in the last couple of days that I've had for a very long time, and again, you will not be able to see it from where you're located. This is in the 1950s, 1954, the first issue of South Carolina Agricultural Research. This area, to the degree you can see anything, is Bowman Field. And it is filled with tractors, Farm and Home Week. People from miles and miles and miles around would bring their tractors and other farm equipment and have a parade through downtown Clemson. They would park them in their exhibits over on Bowman Field. There would be home demonstrations, lots of other types of things. This sounds archaic to us now and also suggests that one of the other major changes during the last 50 years is largely the agricultural basis of the local economy has disappeared and other things have taken place. During the last several years, I've been driving up and down I-20 and I-85 getting here, and particularly last year and again this year as I drove 520 some odd miles from where I currently live to Clemson, I did not see a single cow along the road. Those of you roughly my age or a bit younger and certainly older will remember every time you drove anywhere you would see cows along the road. You have to look pretty hard to find cows on the Clemson campus today, even though there are cow barns. I did happen to see them about 5:40 today, so that must have been a feeding time when they came out. And I'm reasonably sure there's still chicken houses on the campus, but I have yet to ever see one of them now. Before, they were very visible throughout the whole period of time. Numbers of my relatives who worked here were involved in either extension service, the various farm experiments, the experiment station, a variety of other things. So many of us grew up under being much more keenly aware of the agricultural nature of the campus. We have a much, much more diverse population than used to be the case in this area. Around 1900, 98% of South Carolinians were born in South Carolina, and roughly the same percentage for this particular area, whether we're talking about white or black, pretty much equal. Now, of course, we have an incredibly more diverse population, both on this campus and throughout the entire immediate area. Talked to people at the downtown post office, and they've told me that they send mail from Clemson to about 130 countries around the world. So that gives us some idea of the international reach of Clemson outwards and the people who are here as well. We also have numbers of returning African Americans, people who either themselves or their parents had moved to the north and have decided to come back home, sometimes to help with older parents, sometimes just because they wanted to be back in what they recognized as their family's area. In a separate note, some data has been done by all sorts of research that African Americans in this region are more likely to define themselves as Southerners than people in other parts of the country able to define themselves by their particular region. So there's an ongoing tie of various kinds with African Americans to the South. There are increasingly more educational and work opportunities for African Americans, both on this campus and throughout the entire area. Economically, there's still not an equal balance, but things have moved dramatically to close some of the gap between them. There are houses everywhere in this area. Every time I'm here, I just find more and more houses. One of my relatives lived on the cliff up above the area just where the main traffic light is downtown, and every time I see what's going up there, I think it's going to collapse with the weight of all the new buildings up there. Walmarts all over, burger places, Hilton, and one of the sad things, and many of us lament these, various trees being cut down on the campus here and other places. Let me suggest some ways that all of us can help. How can we help preserve in the midst of change? There are, as I've suggested earlier, numerous organizations, projects, Black Historic Markers. The first Black Historic Marker by the state in the upstate was obtained by Lenore Vance Robinson over in Pendleton for the first black school in that area. 1 or 2 or maybe 3 years ago now, the second marker for a black institution in this area was done for Seneca Junior College over in Seneca, and others are being created. African American tour routes are being laid out, and a variety of other types of things. There are lots of restorations that have gone on recently and continuing. Ashtabula, Woodburn, Fort Hill itself, Haygood's Mill, the Tennis Maxwell Cemetery, a schoolhouse over in Central. Lots of people are buying some of the older houses and refitting those and doing very commendable jobs for that. There have been groups documenting tombstones. Back around 1970, for several years, a loosely knit team of different people in different counties worked together, and they documented every readable white cemetery tombstone they could find, and those have been published. And the same teams with some additional additions are working on the black tombstones right now. The first volume of that for Pickens County has come out. There are genealogical societies. As I mentioned, they've got an enormous database. The one thing I would particularly urge is more and more collaboration among these groups, because there are huge projects, this one and that one and that one and that one, and not nearly enough contact among them, and more collaboration, I think, would help us reach a higher level of appreciation of what all is going on in the entire region. One of the things that I think is available tonight, and if it's not, I'll tell you how to get hold of a copy, is a small brochure that was produced at Tri-County Technical College, Moments of Time, which in just 32 pages tries to give a very brief overview of the history of the 3 counties and does some of the highlights of the types of things that I've touched on tonight and others that I haven't. A number of years ago, I had taken an adult tour group to Ellis Island, and I was standing there near an exhibit of Italians who had come over, and there were 4 women, obviously sisters, and I was just sort of casually both looking at the exhibit and listening to them, and they were each of them saying, "I wished I'd asked my mother that. Why didn't we ever get that information? Why didn't we know more about her life?" More about that in just a moment. You realize, of course, as they have told you already, that I have taught considerably. So guess what? You get a homework assignment. When you go outside the door, there will be people ready to hand you a handout, Preserving Upstate South Carolina History and Heritage, how you can help. And some is simply doing your own family and documenting that with oral history and other projects. You can join and support some of the local societies, genealogical, historical, textile, a variety of others. Collaborate by sharing your holdings, and then tap into the amazing resources that you will find in this entire area. There is a separate item I'll tell you about. We don't have copies to share tonight. I had done a selected resources on Anderson, Oconee, and Pickens history, and you can probably attain copies of these either at special collections just over the Strom Thurmond Institute building on the ground floor or at the Pendleton District Commission. There is, again, an enormous amount that we have learned. There's a whole lot more to learn, and all of you who are involved in any of these projects have my thanks and my admiration for what you're doing. Among other things, we certainly have to note some of the people doing this are, of course, the Yandles. They have restored an old house rather than see it torn down. They're enjoying it very much, and they have been likewise very much involved in all the other activities around the area. And I want to also thank all of you who've invited me here, and also those people who've dealt with the various logistics to get us here this evening. Thank you.
Abby Russell, and there he goes. And you had mentioned while you're speaking some of the differences between the African American experience here in the upstate and in the Low Country. In your opinion, which of these differences was the most significant to the upstate community here around Clemson?
Repeat the last phrase.
Which of the differences between the African American experience in the upstate and in the Low Country was the most significant?
One of the significant differences is, of course, simply numbers. African Americans were in the majority in the Low Country, still are. African Americans, as I suggested, going back to the 1800s in the Low Country, mostly did not know the slave owners and vice versa. Didn't have much family contacts. Again, in this area, slaves knew their owners, especially for the smaller plantations. Owners worked side by side with the slaves in the fields or in the kitchen. There was not the same degree of separation that prosperous families could have. People knew each other, like I said with the John C. Calhoun letters, writing back and forth about 50 slaves and everybody in the extended family realizing who those people were. Keep in mind again that we're talking about slavery, but we're also talking about a less distant, less harsh form of slavery. The related factor also is that many of the African Americans in the Low Country retained considerably more of their African retentions, and African Americans to a certain degree in this area became more generally absorbed in the overall culture of the area. I think I can go a step further, and this is conjecture. I don't think anybody has documented this, but apparently a much larger number of the African Americans in the Low Country were brought in from the Caribbean islands, and sometimes fairly early, so they had a whole different background from those who were either born in this area or came down from Virginia and through North Carolina.
Hi, Dr. Megginson. My name is Donovan Jones, and I had a question about the racial relations in the post-Civil War era. You mentioned several instances where the racial relations during that era were actually healthy, positive ones, and I was wondering, in your opinion, why do you think these relationships are so unknown when the average person thinks about South Carolina history?
One of the reasons is simply, again, a bias by most writers of South Carolina history toward the Low Country. So upcountry history has not been nearly as well written about or documented as a lot that's happened in Charleston, as happened in Columbia, Orangeburg. And it's always easier to get more information when you're dealing with a larger percentage of the population. And where there were more troubles with the riots in various places, all of those become much more newsworthy than a somewhat calmer relationship. If I can extend just a little bit on that, in 1867, there was nearly a riot when some black people were involved in a meeting. A white man, unreconstructed, shot and killed one of them. Or vice versa, I'm sorry. He was trying to shoot at them and had a weapon. The black man shot the white man. He and 6 or 8 others were arrested. It took joint effort between Governor Orr, the governor at that time, plus somebody who was from Anderson and knew this immediate area and knew it fairly well, and the head of the federal forces based in Charleston at the time, to work together to prevent there from being almost a riot as a result of that. And ultimately, they were able to do that partly because either through good personal relationships or arm twisting by whites of some of the black men in jail, they finally got one to admit who was the guilty man, and he was executed as a result. But after that, the immediate relations in the area were calmer. One more thing, and I'll get on to you. Another factor is simply balance of power. African Americans in this area were about, depending on which county, which time, 15 to 30% of the population. So they were not able to be, for lack of a better word, as assertive as were people in the Low Country, either just in terms of voting, challenging the structure, or anything else.
Good evening again, Professor Megginson. I'm Rod Andrew, and teach here in the history department on campus. And I guess my question also deals with African American life because, like a lot of us, I've been reading your excellent book, and so that sort of prompted a question in my mind. And your book really stresses continuity in African American life and culture between, say, 1800 and 1900. I think you've sort of spoken along those lines again this evening, and I think you quite reasonably point out that the Civil War and Reconstruction was not a radical break in African American life and culture. There's still basically this native-born people still living in the area. The culture's relatively similar. There's still white domination. Do you think there is a radical break later in African American life? Is there a great outmigration in the 20th century? Is the civil rights movement or something later? Do you continue to see basically continuity?
I'll field at least part of that question. And the short answer is I've done virtually no research on the 20th century, so I'm going to be not very assertive in making comments there. Let me back up and just add a little bit more. Tom Dupree, whom I interviewed, had been born about 1900, was still living in 1990, and his descendants are living in the same house right now, as far as I know. Their great-grandmother, or Tom Dupree's great-grandmother, had come up as a slave around 1800. So a lot of people, African American and white, have roots going all the way back, and there's that type of continuity. But you're talking about more experience, I think, than the other. But the fact that that's there is an underlying factor, I think, in the relationships in this area. Certainly as late as 1950, I wouldn't think there was anything of a radical break. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, there were improved schools for whites and improved schools for black. More improved for white than for black, but some of each. Anderson County, by the way, Anderson City, around 1900, 1920, had among the best schools in the entire state for both white and black. The one factor, and I don't have any way to assess how it occurred, was World War I. I've done a little bit of reading about this. I talked about it a couple of weeks ago at the State Museum Forum on about World War I in South Carolina. But it was a change in African American life because for the first time, African Americans got to leave this area in sizable numbers. They got to have experiences elsewhere in the country. Some were at Langley Field in Virginia, some were in New Jersey. A sizable number went to France. There, according to some of their own stories, in France they found out there was not the color bar there was in this local area. The old song, "How You Can Keep Them Down on the Farm After Gay Paris," certainly applies. And they were, as far as I know, getting identical pay to white soldiers. So that had to have been a beneficial and maybe an almost startling new experience as well. What happened once they came home, I don't think anybody's looked at. I don't think anybody has tried to document. I suspect they went pretty much back to doing the same type of work they had done before. I've dabbled just very briefly in this out-migration issue, and it doesn't seem to have been overwhelming in terms of numbers here as it was in some other places. I know very specific families I've talked to who did leave and go to other places, like Ohio, for example. But then you've got lots of other families that are still continuous here after 150 or 200 years. The out-migration probably occurred primarily in the 1920s, I think, and I don't know specifically, some of you will know better than me. There were new waves probably after World War II and even more in the 1960s. The most contentious black-white issues that had ever occurred in the state then became in this area around the 1960s, partly with Gant coming into Clemson, but also the attempted integration of the downtown theaters here in Clemson and other types of things like that. I do not know a specific date, but I would guess it was the 1980s, maybe the 1990s, before any African Americans felt free to join white churches within the city of Clemson. So I think we're talking more incremental than
Right.
a radical break.
Right. Thank you.
And I'll give just one more thing. Clemson, Tri-County Tech, and a number of others have, as many of you know, provided lots of special opportunities and resources for African Americans. So there's been a deliberate effort by major institutions, including the Clemson United Methodist Church, which I believe was the first church in the state to have a black minister in a white congregation.
Hi, Jim. Will Hyatt, Director of Historic Properties. First, I'd certainly like to congratulate you on your work, having been involved in a minute way nearly 20 years ago. It's quite a project to have stayed with and to have brought to fruition. My question is actually similar to the other three in terms of those who left. I believe in your book you mentioned that less than 5% of the African Americans looked to leave after the war, and certainly in terms of families like Viola Williams or families which we have connection with Fort Hill, the Reed, the Frewster, the Greenlee families have always looked at the Calhoun family and the experience here in not necessarily a negative way, but part of their family experience. And thought I'd have you comment once again on that relationship and really that lack of movement immediately after the war.
I'm not sure I have much more substantially to add, but as you suggest, and as I said before, I've met numbers of families who have returning people coming back here. One of the things that's interesting, and I've very casually looked at this, but if you look at obituaries of African Americans in the newspaper and look where their sons and daughters are, you will likely find sons, daughters, grandchildren in maybe 10 different other states. And so there's been that degree of scattering, but there's been that degree of scattering among white families as well. Probably if we had a show of hands, at least half of you have sons or daughters who've moved substantially away from this area. And some of you have moved into this area from other areas. So, and with transportation and job opportunities, that's become much more available for lots of different people. One of the things that has increasingly impressed me during the last 20 years has been the large number not only of African American family reunions in this area, but also their receptivity in places like the Ramada Inn, where they would not have been admitted maybe 20 or 25 years ago, and it's become almost a small cottage industry as well. One of the people I met, and Dot and I both had lunch with Annette Burney, whose family came from the Samuel Maxwell plantation up in northwestern Oconee County. She is a descendant of some of the slaves from that family, is still living in that immediate area today, and has just had, weekend before last, I believe, a big family reunion down in the Savannah area where they brought family from all around. Anybody who tries to have a family reunion these days, I think, is going to be bringing people from far and wide. That would apply to my family. I've got some relatives here. I've got others in my mother's side, which is from this area, in Charlotte, in Winston-Salem, in Hawaii. I'm in Mississippi, so I think it's happening within the black family, but it's also happening among whites as well. But I've seen enough also with individual families that African Americans living in this area with their families elsewhere, the younger generations, have them coming back and visiting at least, and I've talked to a number of these people as well. One of the interesting people about all of this is Dr. Spencer Crew, who some of you may recognize his name. His father, Rufus Crew, left the area about 1920 and went, I'm not sure where, probably Ohio or thereabouts. Spencer Crew got his doctorate. He, in the 1980s, I guess, yes, 1980s and 1990s, became director of the Museum of American History at the Smithsonian, and is now in charge of another museum, I believe, in Ohio. So the opportunities that people have gotten as they move from elsewhere have enriched the culture generally, but a lot of it has come back to us as well with visitations and other types of things.
Thank you very much.
One final word, don't forget your handouts and start doing this stuff with your own family.
Good advice. Little thank you gift for your visit, and please join us in the lobby, or you can have a chance to talk to Jim.
Okay,
Jim,
I'll
thank
be
you
happy
very
to.
much.
Thank you.